Today I'm going to be explaining the ancient world mysteries Iceberg, and by the time I'm done, you're going to be feeling like Jimmy Neutron with all the brain blasts you're going to be having. And since Thanksgiving's right around the corner, I couldn't think of a better time to stuff you with all this ancient information. And by the way, this video is going to be divided up into 3 separate parts, because if you'll notice, the Iceberg has 20 entries for each level, and there is 6 levels, so there's a whole lot of information to get through. So let's go ahead and hop into level 1 and start out with Atlantis. The sunken city of Atlantis, best portrayed in SpongeBob, it was the tale of a lost city written by the great Plato himself. Now, you all probably know the name, but just in case you aren't familiar with the city itself, it was said to be founded by half-human, half-god entities, and the city was developed into a utopia and then a great naval power. And the formation of the city adds to the mystery as well, because it was made up of concentric islands separated by large moats. Unfortunately not full of alligators though, and drawbridges, but anyways, they were all linked by a canal that went directly to the center of the city, where a great capital city stood. And according to stories from the time, the islands were full of precious metals like gold and silver and exotic animals as well. Truly just a paradise on Earth, it seemed. But if it sounds too good to be true, it most likely isn't, because the location of this city was never really stated, and most historians tend to agree that Atlantis never existed in the first place. Because even at the time that Plato wrote the story about Atlantis, it was already 9,000 some years in the past, and he was retelling it from just what he'd heard about it. There was no written documents passed down through the generations. It was pretty much just word of mouth, so he was writing it as if he was hearing it as a legend. But just because Atlantis didn't exist, that doesn't mean other civilizations that were very similar didn't exist and inspire this fantastical tale of this magical city known as Atlantis. That's very possible, and it probably is true as well. But that also hasn't stopped conspiracy theorists from speculating and exploring and snooping around, all in hopes of finding this mystical land. Unfortunately though, it was to no avail, but maybe one day we'll explore 100% of our oceans and find out once and for all if Atlantis really existed or if it's just another mystery of our past. Late Bronze Age collapse. The collapse of late Bronze Age civilizations has been something that has made archaeologists continually scratch their heads, because it's a mystery that seems to have left little to no clues. But to back it up a bit, it's in reference to the collapse of the civilizations throughout the Levant, near the Middle East, and the Mediterranean around 3,200 years ago. All of these advanced civilizations seemingly disappeared overnight, and while no concrete evidence has ever come forward on that issue, there is a leading theory that has some credibility, and it states that the downfall of these civilizations began with an invasion of ancient Egypt in 1177 BCE by a group known only as the Sea People. And while Ramses III was able to defeat these invaders, ancient Egypt was never the same after the attack, and it steeply declined along with many other of the surrounding cities. One archaeologist likened the decline of these civilizations to dominoes falling one after another very suddenly, and archaeologists are finding all kinds of destruction events that they relate to this time period of seemingly pure abandonment and destruction. Because it seems like in humanity's Oracle of Delphi, aka Pythia, was the priestess who held court at Pytho, the sanctuary of the Delphinians. It was a sanctuary dedicated to the Greek god Apollo, and Pythia were highly regarded, for it was believed that she channeled prophecies from Apollo himself, while being steeped in a dreamlike trance. The Pythia priestess began her work in the 7th century BC, and continued to be consulted until the late 4th century AD. And during this time, she was the highest authority among the oracles, but also one of the most powerful women of the classical world. And in present times, oracles are one of the most well-documented religious institutions of classical Greece. Stonehenge. You most likely already know what this is, but it's a prehistoric monument on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England. It consists of an outer ring of vertical standing stones, which are each around 13 feet tall and 7 feet wide. Each one of the stones as well weighs around 25 tons, and they're topped by horizontal lintel stones. And I was shocked to find out that the stones were that big. Like, I knew they were big before, but when I was researching it, it really shocked me that they weighed that much and were that tall and wide. Just to put it into perspective, an elephant weighs about 3 to 4 tons. So these stones weigh about 3 to 4 elephants. But now to get into the mysteries of Stonehenge, one of the weirdest parts of it is that the massive monument is aligned toward the sunrise on the summer solstice. I can't speak English. And it's also lined up to the sunset of the winter solstice. Jesus Christ. I'm not cutting that out. I want you to see how much I struggle with that word. But archaeologists believe that Stonehenge was constructed sometime between 3000 BC and 2000 BC. And since the people who built Stonehenge left behind no written documents of their culture or anything or how they built it, this has left many to speculate on how it was constructed. Some say they shouldn't have had the technology to do something like this, and they think aliens did it, obviously, because, History Channel, man. Ancient aliens, they're everywhere. If there's a mystery that happened a long time ago, ancient aliens did it. And actually, some theories have been put to the test to see if, they could have done something like this during that time period. And they have been proven to be pretty effective at moving these stones. One such method was rolling the stones on logs, which turned out to be, something they could have done back then. But personally, I think that Bob the Builder and Handy Mandy came together on this to build their magnum opus. The Spear of Longinus, I don't know how to say that word whatsoever, but it's more widely known as the Holy Lance or the Spear of Destiny, so that's what I'll refer to it as. But this is said to be the spear that pierced the side of Jesus while he was being crucified. The spear is mostly shrouded in mystery, though. Big shocker. Being in the same legendary category as the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail, and several countries have claimed ownership of the spear. Most of them have been proven fake, but there are 3 main contenders that kind of seem like they could be the real deal. But the most popular and credible of the 3, the only one that could really have a chance of being the real deal, is in Vienna, Austria, and experts ran tests on the spear and claimed that it was old enough to be the spear, but still don't have enough evidence to say for sure, and most likely never will. Where was the Star of Bethlehem? So this is another entry from the biblical lore. It comes from the book of Matthew, I believe, and the star is what led the 3 wise men to the birth site of Jesus Christ when he was born to Mary and Joseph in a manger, surrounded by all those animals, of course. And the debate of what this star actually could be has kept scholars debating for quite some time, but the leading theory is that if it actually existed, it could have been the Great Conjugation, which actually happened back on December 21st of 2020, which is more importantly, my 18th birthday, so that's another reason why that day is pretty spectacular. And also, the fact that the Great Conjugation won't happen again for another 800 years is also kind of special, I guess. But the Great Conjugation is when Jupiter and Saturn come so close together that from Earth, it almost looks like one object in space. But some other theories about the Star of Bethlehem say that it could have been a supernova, a comet, a solar flare, an alignment of planets similar to the Great Conjugation, or that it simply never happened at all. And you're going to come to soon find out that with all these entries, you're going to pretty much have to make the decision yourself. They're ancient mysteries for a reason. There's no concrete evidence. Zoroaster and Zoroastrainism. I don't know how to say that word. It's a word I can't pronounce, but more importantly, it's an ancient religion that is still being practiced to this day. But let's do a little bit of time traveling and go back to where it all started with the prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster in Greek. Scholars generally believe that he lived sometime between 1500 and 1000 BC, and before him, Persians worshipped deities of the old Irano-Aryan religion, but Zarathustra condemned this practice and preached that Ahura Mazda, the god of wisdom, was the only god they should be worshipping. I'm sorry, I know it sounded very much so like I was reading from note cards right there, and it's because I was. If I didn't write down every bit of that, I would not have been able to pronounce it or get through that whatsoever. But by him doing this, saying that they should be only worshipping this one god, he introduced mankind to the first monotheistic religion. And not only did this monotheistic idea lead the way for religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, it also introduced duality ideas like heaven and hell, the final revelation of the world, Judgment Day, and even angels and demons were all teachings of Zarathustra. And believe it or not, even the concept of Satan was introduced by this religion. And then you have all these other monotheistic religions that came along and stole all his ideas and spat in his face without even citing their sources. P.S. It's also inspired things like Star Wars and Game of Thrones and even Friedrich Nietzsche. Thought that was cool. Exact location of Jesus' tomb. So just in case you don't know, this also comes from the biblical lore when Jesus was crucified, and then on the third day, Easter morning, he was resurrected and rolled the stone away from his tomb and started walking around like nothing ever happened. He was out there like, "Sup, Martha? Sup, George? Sup, Judas? You remember what you did? Bet you do." But anyways, this is pretty much in the same category as the Spear of Destiny because it's been narrowed down to 3 potential locations, none of which can 100% be confirmed as well. But the 3 tombs are called Talpiot Family Tomb, the Garden Tomb, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And although it is said to be impossible to have undeniable proof on if these tombs are the real deal, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has the most early archaeological and literary evidence to support it being the most likely location. So while it's still the most likely out of the 3, you know, nothing's 100%. Speaking of the Bible, though, I'm getting blinded by the holy light right now. I don't know. I'm going to leave it, though. It looks kind of cool. You know, I got my arm shining. But our next entry is Linear A. And this is an ancient writing system used by the Minoans of Crete from 1800 to 1450 BC. And they used it to write the Minoan languages. It was primarily used for religious and palace writings, and the mystery about this language, though, is that none of it has ever been deciphered because there are such little reference points to go on. And you can look at it and see that it looks kind of wacky, kind of zany, kind of looks like wingdings a bit, but yeah, that's about it. Sea Peoples. The Sea People are a hypothesized seafaring confederation that attacked ancient Egypt, like I mentioned in the Lost Bronze Age Civilization entry, and they also attacked other places in the East Mediterranean prior to and during the Late Bronze Age. The origins of the Sea People are undocumented, but there are many theories as to where they did originate from. Some say they came from places like Asia Minor, Aegean, the Mediterranean islands, and even southern Europe. And they're thought to have sailed around the eastern Mediterranean and invaded Anatolia, Syria, Phoenicia, Canaan, Cyprus, and Egypt towards the end of the Bronze Age. So I guess they were just hungry little sea goblins that loved the spoils of war. The Nazca Lines. These are a group of geoglyphs made in the sands of the Nazca Desert in southern Peru that stretch about 1,000 square kilometers, and they're very similar to crop circles in the fact that they just make random shapes and figures and whatnot in the geography that they are located in. But these lines make up nearly 300 different figures, including animals and plants, and they were created sometime between 500 BCE and 500 CE. And the most accepted reason as to why they made all these intricate lines was to please their deities that they worshipped as a sort of an offering. So like if they wanted a good harvest, they would draw something real wacky like a little dog or something in the sands, and then they think their god would see that and be like, "Oh, that's a cute puppy. Have a good harvest, here's some rain." But all ancient mysteries aside, they look very cool, and I believe you can even go on tours to see them, like today. Okay, I give in, finally, I give in. The light's getting to be too much. Look at that, look at my hand. This one looks like a holy hand, and this looks like a dirty hand. This is my masturbating hand, but nonetheless, I'm going to close the shade. Is that better? Hopefully that's better, but now let's get into the Trojan War. This was an epic story told in the Iliad by Homer, the non-yellow one by the way. But in this war, there are heroes, gods, and kingdoms all fighting against each other, and while most of the story is seen as fiction, some people think that there is a little truth sprinkled in, although it would be nearly impossible to separate it and figure out the fact from the fiction. And the war, if it actually did happen, would have taken place sometime between 1194 and 1184 BCE. And the main characters of this tale that are also involved in the war somewhat are Helen of Troy, Menelaus, Agamemnon, Achilles, Paris, Hector, and Odysseus. And while some of them are most definitely creations of Homer, like Odysseus, that doesn't take away from the amazing world that Homer put to paper. I just realized that while I was recording this, I forgot to mention the most important part of the Trojan War, the Trojan horse. It's a huge brain fart. It's like forgetting the Simpsons are yellow. Man, the sun gods really hate me today. Look at that. There's still even a little strand of sun left when I put the shade down. That's crazy. Anywhoosie, back to the biblical lore. When was Jesus born? Everyone is aware that Jesus' birthday is celebrated on December 25th, and now I love me some good Christmas because that means family, food, and presents above all. But as for Jesus' birthday, I have heard that it actually wasn't on Christmas because of shepherds still being in their fields or something. They think it would have taken place sometime in the spring, I believe. But anyways, no scholar knows the exact date of Jesus' birth, or even if there was a birth in the first place, but they estimate that it would have been between 6 BC and 4 BC, based partly on the biblical story of King Herod the Great. But they also debate the month and the day of Jesus' birth, sup cat, because the point of reference for that would have been the Great Conjugation. They say it would have taken place on June 2nd during that time, so his birth would have been around that time as well. But just like everything else, we'll probably never know for sure. We definitely won't know for sure. Unless Jesus himself descends from heaven and says, "Hello, peasants. My birthday was on April the 3rd, actually." Then we'll know for sure. Where is the tomb of Alexander the Great, and how did he die? This is once again a tomb that has been attested in many historical documents, much like Jesus, but nobody knows the exact location. Following Alexander's death in Babylon, he was buried in Memphis before it was transferred to Alexandria, where he was then reburied. And that burial site in Alexandria was thought to be possibly destroyed in the 4th century AD, and since the 19th century there have been over 100 attempts to try and identify the ancient site of Alexander's tomb in Alexandria, but to no avail. And as for how he died, the most likely reason for his death was either malaria or typhoid fever, both of which were rampant in ancient Babylonia. Hanging Gardens of Babylonia. These were described as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They were described as an amazing architectural feat with an ascending series of tiered gardens containing a wide varieties of trees, shrubs, and vines, resembling a large green mountain constructed of mud bricks. But here's the line you've all been waiting for. It's still unclear as to whether these things actually existed or if they were just a poetic creation. The artist depictions I've seen of these things, though, pretty bonkers. If they were real, that would be a really cool place to hang out. Pretty chill, pretty mellow. Moai, I think is how you pronounce that, but these are more monolithic statues that are kind of similar to Stonehenge in the fact that they're massive stones, but these were carved into shapes somewhat resembling humans with large heads, and you're probably familiar with these as well because they're more widely known as the Easter Island heads because they're on Easter Island, and they were supposedly carved between the years 1250 and 1500, and in total there are 900 of these statues, right around that number, which is once again, ridiculous. That absolutely blew my mind when I heard there were 900 of these things. I thought there was like 20, like a baker's dozen or something. No way. I didn't think there were 900. That's like an army. That's a literal army of Easter Island heads. And there are also your standard template theories of them not having the technology to transport these massive stones such long distances to carve them, and let alone that many of them. But by far the best use of these things is in Night of the Living Museum, when they say, "Dum dum, give me some gum gum." Sodom and Gomorrah. This is another biblical tale. We might as well have done the biblical Iceberg, but Sodom and Gomorrah were 2 legendary biblical cities that were destroyed by fire and brimstone from God because of their wickedness. He threw a bit of a temper tantrum. But before God destroyed the cities, he did send 2 angels down before the destruction to advise all good men to get out. And, screw the rest. But this parallels many other stories where the theme is don't disobey God or face his temper tantrum, like the flooding of the earth, for example. And these stories were later used in the Bible in the New Testament as symbols of human wickedness and divine retribution. So you don't be wicked or you face damnation. The Queen of Sheba also comes from the Bible. She was a biblical character who was a powerful queen that visited King Solomon. But of course, the question as to whether she actually existed or not, get ready for it, is up for debate. She's one of the most famous biblical characters though, but there still is surprisingly little known about her. Nobody knows where she came from, it doesn't even mention her name, and it never states where her kingdom is. All are very important traits of a queen. You should probably know her name and where she rules. But there are 2 strands of historical evidence that tie her to 2 different sides of the sea. The Islam and Arabic sources say that her name was Bilqis, and ruled over a kingdom on the southern Arabian Peninsula, and then the other side of the sea, the Ethiopian side, their records say that her name was Makeda, and she ruled the Oxide Empire in northern Ethiopia. So unless concrete evidence comes out, she'll remain a mystery, which I think a character shrouded in a bit of mystery is more interesting than a character you know everything about down to their last nut hair. What knowledge may have been lost at the Library of Alexandria? This is one of my favorite entries on this iceberg because it's a very intriguing thought experiment, if nothing else. But anyways, historically speaking, this library stood in Egypt for 300 years after it was commissioned by Ptolemy I and II early in the 2nd century BC. And its goal was to store practically all written knowledge in existence within its walls. They even eventually had to build a sister library next to it because the main one got so full. And historians claim that there were 700,000 books that were lost when the library burnt down. And while we have no idea what the content of these books were, that's where our imagination comes into play, and stuff like, what if they knew the meaning of life, or what if they made the everlasting boner pill come into play? And that's what really gets your brain, your gears turning. But unfortunately, we'll never know the answer to that question because it was burnt down by Julius Caesar in 48 BC. There's also a saying that the library being burnt down set humanity back about 100 years, but some scholars disagree with this and say that it's a wild exaggeration because they said it most likely they stored content that was like lesser useful works of literature, and it wasn't like societally impactful stuff they had in there. Now, our last entry on level 1 here is, where was the Garden of Eden? I don't think I have to say it at this point, but it's another biblical entry. And according to the Bible, the Garden of Eden was located on the east side of a region called, well, Eden. Also, according to the Bible, the garden was a beautiful place that was supplied with water from 4 different rivers, and it also had a lush garden. And apparently the garden also contained gold, bdellium, and onyx stones, as well as well-watered trees. Sounds like quite the paradise indeed. But the biggest point people use to try to find and locate where the Garden of Eden is by locating the rivers that branched out into 4 other rivers known as the Phisphon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. But the problem with that is that 2 of those rivers don't even exist now, and they maybe never even did. And if we're going based on the biblical lore, there was kind of a worldwide flood that probably did a number on the geography of the world, making it pretty much impossible to pinpoint the actual location where the garden existed. So, once again, say the line, Derek! It's likely that we'll never find the location because it may have never even existed. Time to dive deeper. Let's go into level 2 with the first entry, Cambyses' Lost Army. I swear I can't pronounce most of these names, you're going to have to forgive me. I have a very ancestral tongue, I'm from West Virginia. Please find it in your heart to forgive me. But this lost army dates back to 524 BC, when Persian Emperor Cambyses supposedly sent an army of 50,000 men to attack and enslave the Ammonians. But then we come to find out from Herodotus, an ancient historian, that the entire army vanished after a violent sandstorm. So where did they go? That's the question that scholars and internet scholars have been trying to figure out for ages. And the theories range from it never happened to there's an army buried under the sand. And also, some people think that Herodotus may have been fed false information, or that Herodotus could have just made this entire thing up to make Cambyses look bad. I feel so dumb saying those names when I don't know if I'm pronouncing them right. Etruscan Civilization and its origin. The Etruscan civilization was developed by the people of, you guessed it, Etrusa, in ancient Italy, with a common language and culture that formed a federation of city-states. They were known for their rich mineral resources and being a major Mediterranean trading power, but sadly, much of its culture and even its history have been obliterated or assimilated from its conqueror, Rome. However, their origins are a topic of much debate. Many think the Etruscans were Eastern peoples transplanted to northern Italy due to a famine, and revisiting with our old friend Herodotus, he wrote that they were originally from Lydia in Anatolia, but this whole period of time is very chaotic, so it's hard to pinpoint their exact origin. Helicopter hieroglyphics. Exactly what it says. Some people think that this ancient mural shows technology that was way ahead of its time. This mural originates from the temple of Seti I in Abydos, and has gave conspiracy nerds boner fuel for their wacky theories about ancient Egyptians being time travelers, and I'm sure this gave History Channel a good couple episodes of Ancient Aliens content. But the reality of the mural is much less grand compared to the time travel theory, and it has to do with us as humans seeing patterns where patterns don't really exist. Also known as pareidolia, we do it all the time when we see faces and stuff in clouds, or like Jesus in a piece of bread or whatever, but what the mural actually depicts has to do with the legacies of different rulers in ancient Egypt, where it was common for a new ruler to recarve an area that had already been carved. So these are really just two different images on top of each other, unfortunately. Ancient helicopters and UFOs would have been pretty dope. Plague of Athena. This plague killed tens of thousands in 430 BC, nearly a third of the population actually, but its cause is still unknown. I get a chuckle every time saying that. It began when people started falling ill with a disease no one had encountered before in the port of Athens, and the disease was spreading quickly, and reports of the same disease were heard in places like the island of Lemnos in North Aegean and a few other locations as well. A rumor of the time was that people thought the Spartans had poisoned the wells and drinking water was the cause of all this sickness. And in a matter of weeks, it had spread to pretty much everyone in the city, affecting everyone from every walk of life. And the main source of information about the epidemic comes from the historian Thucydides, who not only witnessed the events firsthand, but survived the disease himself. And the direct quote from him is, "People in good health were all of a sudden attacked by heats in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes, the inward parts such as the throat or tongue becoming bloody and emitting unnatural and fetid breath." He also states that patient skin was a reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. So it was a pretty gnarly disease. And all of these symptoms of accounts from the disease lead modern scholars to think it sounds a lot like Ebola, but confirming this disease would need DNA, which isn't exactly accessible from the 5th century BC, so the exact disease shall remain a mystery. Shrunken Heads. This one's a bit of nightmare fuel, fair warning. Shrunken heads are decapitated human heads that are prepared in a special way for display for certain occasions. They are a mystery from ancient times that we still see practiced today in certain native tribes, but the purpose behind creating and keeping shrunken heads has bounced between magic, sacrifice, trophy, ritual, and trade from time to time. What? But they were most commonly used to scare off and warn enemies, and it's only the Yavaro from northern Peru and southern Ecuador people who practice this horrific art and craft. Now, as for how it's made, if you have a weak stomach, get ready. They start by decapitating an enemy's head and bringing it to a place of worship where they would sew the eyes and mouth shut. Once this is all done, the heads are then put into a big pot over a fire, like a witch's cauldron type deal, and left to boil for a specific amount of time. The heat and pressure from consistent boiling shrunk the skull and helped separate the skin and flesh from the bone. Then the skin and the hair of the head would be carefully separated from the skull, which was very important for the final look of the sansas, which is an alternate name for these things. The remaining flesh on the skull would also be scraped off as well, and then the skin slit used to remove the skull would then be sewn closed with care after turning it inside out. And I may or may not show you an image. I'm probably going to show you an image. It'll probably be up here the whole time while I'm talking about it. It's pretty haunting. It's pretty scary. So bada bing, bada boom. You'll now have a nightmare tonight. Just look at that face. Look at that head. Nightmare, nightmare, nightmare. Frescoes inside the Villa of Mysteries. The Villa of Mysteries is a well-preserved suburban ancient Roman villa on the outskirts of Pompeii, southern Italy. This villa is famous for the series of exquisite frescoes in one room, which are usually thought to show the initiation of a young woman into a Greco-Roman mystery cult. These are now among the best known of the relatively rare survivals of ancient Roman painting from the 1st century BC. And a fresco, just for explanation, is a technique of mural painting executed by using freshly laid plaster. For example, the Creation of Adam by Michelangelo is a fresco. But the frescoes in the Villa of Mysteries date back all the way to 70 through 60 BC, and their interpretation is what is actually the mystery. As I mentioned above, most people believe it depicts a woman undergoing initiation into a Dionysian mystery, a mystery cult that was dedicated to a god known to the Romans as Bacchus. Another popular theory, though, is that it depicts a woman undergoing the rites of marriage, so it's pretty much up for interpretation. Why do so many mythologies have flood myths? You've probably heard your fair share of these flood myths. Most notably to me is the flood depicted in the Bible, where Noah built his ark to repopulate the earth after this catastrophe. But there are parallels between most of these flood myths, in that a good majority of them include an angry god and a catastrophic event that destroys the world, leaving only few to survive. But let's rewind the clock a bit to perhaps the first ever known flood myth from the ancient Mesopotamia. It's written in the Epic of Gilgamesh and was written on 12 stone tablets. And Gilgamesh in this story was a king who served for 126 years. Yeah, pretty old. You thought your grandma was old. But after the death of a friend, he was searching for the secret to immortality when he met an immortal man named Utnaphism. But this immortal man's story is very similar to Noah's from the Bible, because he was granted immortality after building a ship called the Preserver of Life and surviving the Great Flood, where on board were his relatives and all species of creatures. And some other civilizations that had these similar flood stories were the Aztecs, the Greeks, there's a Hindu one, a Buddhist one, a Chinese one, a Norse one, and even the Aborigines had one, as well as the Ojibwe tribe. They had one as well. Now, obviously, they aren't all as similar as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical story I first mentioned, although the Gilgamesh story was written first, so the Bible just kind of copied off of ancient Mesopotamia's papers, but it's still very interesting to learn that all these very different cultures had such similar stories to tell. Phaistos Disc. This is a disc formed from fired clay from the Minoan palace of Phaistos on the island of Crete, dating back to the Middle or Late Minoan Bronze Age. It's about 6 inches in diameter and was discovered back in 1908 by the Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier. The disc itself features 241 tokens made up of 45 distinct signs, and many have attempted to decipher the code on the disc, but it's pretty much agreed upon that there isn't enough context to decipher it properly, and apparently there's even a small group of archaeologists who think the disc could be a hoax or a forgery. But it's pretty cool to look at. You can look at it, gawk at it for a second. I'm not going to shame you. Everburning Lamps. These are lamps that burn without necessary oil. There's stories of these lamps that come from all around the world. These ancient ever-burning lamps are usually found in tombs or enclosed places, even though these places have been sealed for hundreds of years. Examples include the tomb of Pallas, a tale from the reign of Emperor Justinian of a lamp lit 550 years ago that was still burning. And by far the most perplexing example of all of these ever-burning lamps comes from Jetuel the rabbi, and these were documents from the 13th century that state there was a lamp outside of this guy's house that burned continually without any apparent supply of oil. And every time someone questioned him about it and asked him about it, he always refused to discuss the mechanics of the lamp. So I guess it was a touchy subject for him, I guess. Indus Script, also known as the Harappan Script, it's a corpus of symbols produced by the Indus Valley Civilization that date back to 2600 through 1900 BCE. Most of the inscriptions that contain these symbols are extremely short and they read right from left, but the language has yet to be fully deciphered. But the efforts are still ongoing, so maybe soon they'll connect the dots and we'll have a new language. Rome's secret name. I found this one very interesting while I was researching it, but there are many fascinating theories regarding this topic. Some people assume the secret name comes from the Pelasgians. It is said that the people named it a word meaning strength and value, and some people say its origins are from the Aeneid's verse concerning the river Tiber. Some even argue it is an evolution of the terms Ruma, Rumia, and Rumina, the ancient translation of udder, concerning the famous wolf-fed Romolo and Remo. But there is a very old source that suggests the sacred name of the city was Amor, though the names Serenia and Herpa have also been put forward as candidates for the secret name. And although there is a Latin goddess of silence called Agerona, who was the protecting goddess of Rome and the keeper of the sacred name of the city, which might not be pronounced lest it should be revealed to her enemies, it was even thought that Agerona itself was the secret name. Anyway, anyone who revealed the name, Romans tended to execute, and the Romans never mentioned it except in veiled terms, so it pretty much is still a mystery, and it was kind of perplexing, kind of hard to wrap my head around this topic. The death of Romulus. You can find several theories on the death of Rome's founder and first king from ancient sources. He was said to have died at the age of 55 after a 37-year reign on July 7th. The authors all agree he didn't die of natural causes though, but they all disagree on the actual events that took place. And here are the possibilities. 1. He ascended to heaven. Yes, the poet Ovid wrote that he did not die of natural death because he was brought to heaven by his divine father Mars, where he became a god named Quirinus, and his wife also ascended with him, I believe. And the second one, a coup d'etat of the patricians, is another theory because they had a reason to hate Romulus because he potentially put the Romans' lives in danger through his decisions and behavior. Now, one of those sounds more real than the other, but I'll leave it up for you to decide. Where is Cleopatra's tomb? Another tomb mystery. This is our third one on this video. But Cleopatra, just in case you don't know, she was the last queen of Egypt, and her tomb has been lost for more than 2,000 years, causing massive intrigue and mystery, just like in the case of Jesus' tomb and Alexander the Great's tomb. But unfortunately, the chance of finding her tomb are very slim. But as for how she died, it's said that she killed herself by getting a venomous snake called an asp to bite her. And according to ancient writers, she was initially buried with Antony in a mausoleum. But after that, it's very unknown. Missing poems from the epic cycle. We all probably know the epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the names of these lost epics are the Sapria, the Aethiopus, the Little Iliad, the Eluptrus, aka the Sack of Ilium, Nostia, aka the Return, the Telegony, and I'm not going to explain these stories because I can barely pronounce the titles, but you can look up each one of them if you're interested. It's pretty neat. Dead Sea Scrolls. These were discovered by Israeli archaeologist Yuval Peleg when he stopped his jeep outside the Dead Sea in a fairly harsh and remote area where he would soon find the most important religious text in the Western world that were found in 1947. But the Dead Sea Scrolls are made up of 800 pages made of animal skin, papyrus, and forged copper that allow us to have a deeper understanding of the Bible. In the text, there are parts of every book in the Old Testament except for the book of Esther, and also in the scrolls were previously unknown hymns, prayers, commentaries, mystical formulas, and even the earliest version of the Ten Commandments that we know of. And most of the scrolls were written between 200 BC and 70 AD, predating the previously oldest known Hebrew text of the Bible by 8 to 11 centuries. Gobekli Tepe. This is a monument in Turkey that completely reshaped our previous ideas of civilization, and it was built, get this, 6,000 years before Stonehenge. It consists of more than 20 circular stone enclosures, the largest of which was 20 meters across, and a circle of stone with two elaborately carved pillars 5.5 meters tall at its center. And the carved stone pillars were very eerie, stylized human figures with folded hands and fox pelt belts that weighed up to 10 tons. So carving and erecting these things must have been quite the tremendous challenge for people who hadn't even yet domesticated animals or invented pottery, let alone metal tools. And these structures are about 11,000 years old or more, making them humanity's oldest known monumental structures, built for no shelter but for some other purpose. And this was all discovered by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt when he was excavating on a Turkish mountaintop. Indus Valley Civilization. The Indus Valley is full of mysteries, including an undeciphered script and its godless lifestyle, which makes it perfect for this iceberg. It was the first Indus city to be discovered, and the civilization was formed during the Bronze Age in the northwestern region of South Asia, and it lasted from 3300 BCE to 1300 BCE. But the mystery of this place is very similar to the other civilizations we discussed because most of their culture and way of life is unknown due to us not being able to decipher their Indus Script, which is the key to their civilization. Without language, we're just kinda lost. Sappho's lost poems. Quote, "Who, O Sappho, is wronging you? For if she flees, soon she will pursue. If she refuses gifts, rather will she give them. If she does not love, soon she will love, even unwilling." This poetry belongs to Sappho, an ancient Greek poet from the island of Lesbos, and we actually know very little about her. Shocker. But the lines from a moment ago are Sappho's work, Ode to Aphrodite, written around 625 through 570 BCE. And as it would be, that's the only completed poem we have of her entire works. And in total, there are more than 700 fragmented lines of her work that we know of today. So what could have happened to erase this much of her work? Well, the leading theories are they could have been censored by the medieval church because Sappho was a lesbian, and also there could have been just poor record keeping for such an obscure dialect. The mystery of the elongated skulls. This mystery revolves around human skulls found that look like they come straight out of the movie Alien, but the reality of these long skulls are pretty intriguing. It's a practice that is generally unknown to people today, but it was part of a ritual of deforming the skull into unnatural shapes, and this was done when a person was a newborn, because newborns are very pliant and malleable, I guess is a good way to put it, and it was a huge part of many societies around the globe for thousands of years. But the reason they did it is still a mystery to this day. I get a kick every time I say that phrase. I'm sorry, I try to keep a straight face. But the action of this was performed by putting two boards on the head, one on the front and one on the back, and then a cloth was wrapped tightly around the skull to make it push back and upwards. But the main theory on why this was performed is that it was a sign of being royalty or high social class. But some other researchers think that this was performed by some tribes to set themselves apart from other neighboring tribes. And when these skulls were first discovered, there were claims of them not even being human, because you always got to have an alien theory in an ancient mysteries video. Now, the final entry of this video. Where is the Ark of the Covenant? So, Jewish and Christian tradition presents the Ark of the Covenant as a physical manifestation of God's presence and supreme power. Ancient Israelites marched the Ark into battle and brought whole cities to their knees. The Ark was so sacred that touching it meant instant death. And once it was laid to rest in the temple of Jerusalem's holiest chamber, only the high priest was allowed in its presence, and only once a year. And one of the most well-known theories about the Ark is linked to Ethiopia's 14th century national epic, the Kebra Nagast. According to this account, the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon in Jerusalem during the 10th century BCE and had a son by him on her journey home. Their son, named Menelik, returned to Jerusalem once he was of age. Although Menelik ultimately chose to go back to his mother, Solomon sent him with a company of Jewish scions. But unbeknownst to Solomon or Menelik, these companions, frustrated about leaving Jerusalem, decided to take a souvenir of sorts, the Ark of the Covenant. It was too late for Solomon to retrieve the sacred vessel by then, and Menelik brought the Ark with him to the city of Axum, and, with the Ark at his side, he later conquered a number of surrounding territories for what would become the Ethiopian Empire. But most historians think that if it did exist, the more than 3,000-year-old relic either disintegrated over time or was destroyed. But this too is only speculation, of course. For many, the final fate of the Ark of the Covenant remains a fascinating mystery and perhaps an unsolvable one. And that's going to do it for the first part of the Ancient World Mysteries Iceberg. Maybe you enjoyed, maybe you didn't. If you're still watching at this point, I salute you for your service because you somehow bared my voice for this long. Truly a feat, a magnificent one at that, even more impressive than Kratos taking down Thor. It's pretty bonkers what you just did. But anyways, allow me to hop off your wiener. I just want to say thanks, and I'll catch you in the next one.